We're at the point where in the gospel where Jesus earlier had plainly told the disciples that he would be killed and he would rise from the dead on the third day. Now, we know that he died on the Friday, the Good Friday. 1, 2, 3. What does that make it? Is that Sunday or Monday? 3 days. A lot of people have been confused about that. He rose on the third day, but Sunday, is that the second or the third day? Where are you counting from? In fact, our text says in the start of verse 19, on the evening of that first day of the week, which is Sunday, right? So is Friday to Sunday 2 days or 3 days? Well, the answer really is in the way that first century Jewish people would reckon days. They would include a day and night or any part thereof as a whole day. So, for instance, if something happens in part of the day, it's considered a day and a night. And the reason that we read from Esther before is because there's a really good example of that in the book of Esther. So let's have another quick look. Esther from chapter 4, verse 16, where Esther says, "Go gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my maids will fast as you do when this is done." In other words, when the 3 days and 3 nights is done with, I will go to the king. Then we read in chapter 5, on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. Now, wait a minute. She didn't wait until the whole 3 days and 3 nights were up. She went on the third day. And what's going on? Well, it's the same principle. The Jewish reckoning of a day and night is any part thereof is counted as a full day. And that's why we speak of the third day as Sunday. It's the whole night and day were considered as one day. So Jesus did rise on the third day. But there's something else about this Jesus rising on the third day. And it's the way that John describes it. John does not describe it as Jesus rose on the third day, even though that's exactly what Jesus had said, I'll rise on the third day. John specifies what day of the week it is. On the first day of the week. He doesn't say it was the third day. Now, why is that more important to mention what day of the week it is compared to on the third day? Surely the third day would be more important, considering that's when Jesus said he would rise. Or John could have just said he rose later that night, or he could have put it a lot of ways. In fact, he repeats the same thing on several occasions, even in this chapter, that Jesus' resurrection appearances were on the first day of the week. Right back from when we started this chapter in chapter 20, chapter 20, verse 1, early on the first day of the week. That, of course, is when Mary and the other women came to the tomb. But he mentions what day of the week it is, on the first day of the week. In fact, all the 4 Gospels introduce the resurrection as being on the first day of the week, rather than what we might have thought was more significant, the third day from the crucifixion. Why is that so important to mention this, what day of the week it is? Twice in this chapter, John mentions it. We just mentioned verse 1 and later in verse 19. And then he notes that they don't see Jesus again until he appears again. When does he appear? Exactly 1 week later in verse 26, on the first day of the week. So all the first appearances of Jesus are on this first day of the week. And John, along with the other gospel writers, highlight this fact. What's the big deal about the first day of the week? It's Sunday. Well, what's the big deal about that? The big deal is that in this very gospel we saw how in the beginning God created, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word created all things. God created this world on the first day of the week. And Christ's resurrection is the new creation, the recreating. Remember, he wasn't just dying for our sins, he was dying a reconciliation of the whole world. And where did it happen? On the first day of the week. Jesus was in the grave over the old Sabbath, and he rises to new life on this first day of the week. And this resurrection was so significant for these disciples that from the earliest beginning of the church, they began in the New Testament worshipping on the first day of the week rather than the old Sabbath. Jesus was in the grave on the old Sabbath. Now they're just out of nowhere. It's like the resurrection is so significant that instead of a direct announcement, by the way, from now on we're going to worship on the first day of the week, it's that the resurrection itself is the announcement. It's the world changing, the redemption of the world, this new creation. And it seems that they just started worshipping on the first day of the week from that time. You see it in the New Testament. Acts chapter 20, verse 6. Let's read that together. But that's Luke the writer and the Apostle Paul and so on, we sailed from Philippi after the feast of the unleavened bread, and 5 days later joined the others at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. So they're there 7 whole days, and then what happens? On the first day of the week, we came together to do what? To break bread. That's the Lord's Supper, the communion. Paul spoke to the people, the preaching. In other words, they'd been there whole 7 days, but they choose to come together for worship on the first day of the week. Even the collection we're commanded to take up on the first day of the week. Have a look at 1 Corinthians 16 verse 1. Now about the collection for God's people, do what I told the Galatian churches to do on the first day of every week. Each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with his income. Why the first day of the week? That's the day when you are coming together to worship. It just began from the time of the resurrection. And the historical record shows that not only in the New Testament had they begun worshipping on the Sunday, on the first day of the week, but also the earliest records from immediately after the apostles. And you can go back to the earliest church fathers, some of whom lived during the time of the apostles. You know, Ignatius, Irenaeus, and so on. And you go on through those early years, immediately Polycarp, guys who were disciples of John and so on, and they all testify. The new Sabbath was now the first day of the week, Sunday. So we're going to have to disagree with our Seventh-day Adventist friends who insist that it's still Saturday, and also the Seventh-day Adventists are told by their leaders that the idea of Sunday worship didn't come in until 300 years later in the time of Constantine. Well, you only have to have a very cursory glance at history, and I can give you an actual list of those church fathers, if you're interested, who testify that from the earliest beginnings, from immediately the time of the apostles, they were worshipping on the first day of the week, and it didn't just come in 300 years later. Constantine, of course, gave freedom to do it and so on, but and some sort of official place for it, but it certainly didn't get invented at that time. So the resurrection was so central to the first Christians. It impacted them so much. It was the thing that turned their world upside down. Indeed, it did turn the world upside down. So the resurrection then becomes the most attacked doctrine in the Bible. Many have tried to find ways, because if you can destroy that resurrection, you can destroy Christianity. So people have made all kinds of attempts to try and discredit it. How? Well, they come up with all kinds of things. We looked way back at the crucifixion, the swoon theory and all that sort of stuff, and that's discredited and so on. But once Jesus is risen, people have said, well, maybe the disciples were just so desperate to believe that they hallucinated. They thought they saw him because they wanted so much to believe it. We're going to look at that today. We're going to look at these disciples, about their attitude. We're going to find that when they're there in this upper room, they're not there waiting in anticipation, hoping and believing that Jesus is going to appear. What we're going to see is a bunch of supreme cowards who were thinking of anything but a resurrection, even in defiance of what Jesus had told them. They didn't even give it a thought. So let's look at our text today, verse 19. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jews, the Jewish leaders, they're worried about them. The disciples are a bunch of scaredy cats who have locked the doors and they're afraid of the authorities. Now, before we get too harsh on them, we can sort of relate a little bit because they had plenty to be afraid of. When someone in ancient Rome was executed for sedition against Rome, which Jesus was, they very often would also execute the followers to make sure the whole thing is stamped out. And the Jewish leaders had managed to convince the Romans to execute Jesus. It would be very easy for them to then follow up with this and go again to Pilate and so on and go, these guys are causing up the trouble, we've got to execute them as well. So John had criticised earlier in this gospel the nighttime followers, Nicodemus, who followed Jesus at night because he was too afraid to come out, Joseph of Arimathea, who believed in Jesus secretly, and John said they loved the praise of men rather than the praise of God. And yet, here's John, along with all these other disciples, they're the nighttime, they're the scaredy cats now. Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, we already met in chapter 19, came out of the darkness, stood for Jesus, giving him a proper burial and so on. While the disciples that actually travelled with Jesus and were so bold when he's doing the miracles and stuff, and now he's not here, and we've got the locked doors and we're afraid. They're the scaredy cats. Luke chapter 22 verse 12 tells us that the room where they are was this upper room, and it was well furnished, and it's big enough to hold them all. So it's probably a pretty decent, well-to-do kind of place downtown Jerusalem. They're all there. They've got the doors locked. They're hoping the locked doors are going to keep the bad guys out, the secure them. They're in genuine fear for their lives. And I wonder if we would be much different, because there are people who would want to get rid of them. We think in terms of like horrible people who would burst in like terrorists and stuff. It's over there, isn't it? There was a terrorist situation this last week in Moscow, and it's sort of so far away that we don't really relate to it. And we don't relate to it, we think even if there were a rare occasion in Australia where some can happen, it can't happen, we accept that, but we kind of feel that our authorities would seek them out and find them out before it happens in most cases. We feel pretty secure here. But what if the terrorists were in this country? What if the terrorists were the authorities? Because that's what the situation is for the disciples. It's the Jewish authorities that are their enemies. They're the ones who have the law, and they managed to get Jesus executed under the law of the land. It wasn't a terrorist act in that sense. And now they figure, well, if we're associated with the one who's been executed as a criminal, then, it's reasonable to think that we could be next. And we don't have to really think and relate to this in our lives, because we're not confronted by this. We're not back there in the first century. But what if things did change here? And, we've got this debate now over religious vilification laws and all this sort of thing. Changed drastically. And last week, Bill gets dragged out for preaching in the name of Jesus, and they execute him. And you're all here this week, and the authorities burst in again and says, anybody here associated with Bill Medley? And you all go, Bill who? That heretic? Don't have anything to do with him. No. Not a chance. We can relate to the disciples. If we actually stood ourselves back there in that time, Peter, of all people, knew that if he had not denied Jesus those 3 times, that the story could have read a little differently. It could have been Jesus crucified with 2 criminals either side of him and Peter. That's the kind of thing that Peter was trying to avoid when he denied Jesus. And now Peter's in this room again. He's actually in fear with the rest of them, cowering in fear. And he's thinking to himself, well, in the end, they did get Jesus, and now they could be after us. And this is not someone that we just loved and followed. This is one we hoped was going to be the salvation of Israel. And now he's dead, and there's nothing he can do about that. And, John over there saw some empty grave clothes and thinks something out of that. But he's not here, he's dead. And Mary Magdalene came running back and saying, I've seen the Lord, but she's a woman, right? Well, you can't believe woman is not credible in a court of law. So people can believe what they want to believe. No, this is it. We're stuck here and we're in danger. Jesus is dead and we're next. So the disciples here are in fear. If there's one thing they are not, it is gullible people wanting so badly to believe that they just imagined it. It's just the opposite. These guys are actually the biggest skeptics out. People say, people back then were more gullible and, we're more skeptical. No. These were much bigger skeptics. These were much bigger skeptics. They weren't even thinking about the risen Saviour, even though Jesus had told them. And they supposedly believed him. These were cowards who fled first at his arrest, remember? They fled back then. Now they're even more afraid. They're hiding out in fear. The doors are locked. They tossed out everything that Jesus said about rising from the dead. They tossed out everything Jesus said about being ready to give your life for me. And the one thing they are not is just gullible people wanting so badly to believe. They're unbelieving cowards. The question I want to look at today is, what changed them? Because it wasn't a little change. It wasn't, I've changed my mind now. What turned these cowards and skeptics into becoming such a powerful force that a few unknown fishermen and ordinary people would become the strongest force the world has ever known that spread a message passively into becoming the largest religion in the world down to today. So large that if you put all the other major world religions together, it's nearly as many as that put together. What transformed these guys from being scared behind locked doors, transformed, like Peter we mentioned, denied Jesus 3 times for fear of arrest, scaredy cat in that room, right, cowering, locked doors, into a man who would so boldly preach to the very people he's trying to escape from in front of them, be put in jail, miraculously escapes and goes back and preaches in front of them again, ultimately to give his life rather than reject Jesus as the Son of God. In fact, they put it to him. He's deny Jesus or you're going to get crucified. He said, go ahead and crucify me, but I request to be done upside down. I don't deserve to go the way my Lord did. As tradition has it, he was crucified upside down. The authorities only too willing to accommodate him. But what transformed him? He was the guy who was scared. And he wasn't the only one. All of the disciples, apart from one, were executed for the faith. Peter's brother Andrew. What transformed that fisherman who was there in that room, scared, afraid, into a man who also, in the face of death, would not reject Jesus as the Son of God. He too was crucified. Matthew was one of the cowards in that locked room. The former money swindling taxation worker. That guy, he was in that room. He was scared too. What transformed him into the man who would later give his life executed by the sword because he would not deny Jesus is the Son of God? What transformed him? And this wasn't some sort of cult thing, mass hysteria thing. You know, you hear about these cults where people, will commit a suicide pact and we're all in it together. We're going to go for the cause. It wasn't like that. They weren't all executed together. In fact, they were executed. They had different mission trips from here throughout the world and throughout the known world at the time, and they were executed separately. Some decades apart. Some rotted in prisons for years before being executed. Plenty of time to rethink this. It's a few decades on now, and maybe, you know what it's like if you, sometimes when you're younger, you guys who were hippies in the 60s or, the people who living in the communes and they got the cause and all that sort of stuff. Today they're the yuppies in the terrace houses around here, And, what happened? What happened to the big cause? What happened? Time has a way of rethinking, this whole idea of, was it really that important back then, You get a different perspective over time, don't you? But that didn't happen with the disciples. In fact, time only increased their passion to be ready to die for Jesus. Just the opposite. They were even more certain. This transformation for them was forever. And the disciples gathered in that room for fear. James, son of Alphaeus, he too was one of the cowards there, later crucified for Jesus. What transformed him? Philip, he was there, coward for Jesus, later crucified for Jesus. What transformed him? Simon, crucified. What transformed him from being a coward? Thaddeus, coward for Jesus, later executed by a firing squad of arrows, ready to die for Jesus. What transformed him? Bartholomew, coward for Jesus, later crucified for the faith. James Zebedee, the brother of John, remember he was the early one to be executed, because you can read about that in Acts 12, where he had Herod beheaded him with the sword for the faith. James was in that room. He was a coward and later ready to die for Jesus. One guy who wasn't in that room at the time, but the most famous skeptic of all, the doubter. Unless I see the nail marks in his hands. And we'll look at Thomas the doubter a little later in this gospel. But how about that? The most famous skeptic of all. Not only coward but skeptic, right? But becomes the guy who was willing to give his life for Jesus and was executed by a spear thrust. What transformed the greatest skeptic of all? There are others who weren't even in that room because they weren't even believers. They weren't afraid because they just didn't believe. Jesus' own brother, James and Jude. We read about in this gospel earlier in chapter 7 how they were unbelievers. And yet, we know that those unbelievers later, James, for instance, it's recorded even outside the Bible, Josephus, the Jewish historian, says that because of James' faith, his staunch faith to the end, he was tossed off a wall and stoned to death for proclaiming Jesus as the Son of God. What transformed even an unbeliever? You ever heard that the Bible was all written by people who are biased? Well, a couple of those unbelievers have letters in the New Testament. That's what James and Jude are, former unbelievers. But what would transform someone who is not in that room because he was part of the very authorities that the disciples were hiding from? He was so zealous to stamp out Christianity, he even carried out murder of Christians. A murder of Christians, and yet years later he wrote more books of the New Testament than any other writer. He died for the faith, testifying to Jesus as the Son of God. What transformed that man, former murderer of Christians, into becoming the Apostle Paul, who Nero cut his head off in around 67 AD? What transformed a former enemy of the Christians into being one of the most prolific writer of the New Testament? What transformed all of these cowards here in this room with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, when it was those same Jewish leaders they were ready to preach in front of, even to be put in jail, even ready to be executed. Pretty soon after this, they would be preaching in front of those same Jewish leaders they're hiding from. What transformed them? Well, let's look at our text again, verse 19. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jews, what transformed them? Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." That's what transformed them. Jesus rose from the dead And it was really him. They couldn't believe it before, and now they saw with their own eyes. And he steps in and he says, Shalom, peace be with you. They were never the same again, and the world has never been the same since. They were transformed. If you have believed in Jesus, have you been transformed? Has it caused you to realize he really did die on the cross for my sins? And I need to repent of that and turn and live to please him. Has it transformed you in the way you love God and love one another? In the way you believe in the big picture, this life is not the end, there's an eternity. And what I do with my time, my resources, my life is meant to be for him. Has it transformed you if you really believe what he did in dying and rising again to give life to this world, and you've been entrusted with that message to pass on to others? Has it moved you? Have you already handed on an invitation to Wednesday night or to our Easter services next week? Has it transformed you? Because if you really believe Jesus died for you and rose again, it will transform you.